Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where the PMBOK guide suddenly makes sense. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson, we focus on the plan procurement's management process. It's important to plan in order to ensure that the project is able to efficiently acquire the product, result, or services for the best price and quality while conforming to pertinent procurement policies and procedures. So in this lesson, we explain what procurement management planning is all about and why it has so many inputs. There are 9 inputs for this process, and we will go through each one and how they influence the process. We also discuss the different types of contractual agreements that can be reached between a buyer and a seller. Different contract types allow for different payment arrangements and assignment of risk to the buyer and seller. They provide various ways for rewarding sellers for meeting procurement objectives. Although not officially a concept in the PMBOK guide, we will be defining strategic alliances and the important role that they play in procurement. We clarify what the make or buy analysis is, what options we have, and discuss some major factors that come into play in the make or buy analysis and decisions. And then we also review different procurement selection criteria. This lesson comes to you in 3 parts. Here in part 1, we'll give you a general overview of the processes and describe the inputs. Then in part 2, we're going to take a closer look at contracts. And finally in part 3, we'll discuss tools, techniques, outputs of the process, and I'll also review the major points of our overall lesson. Let's start with the knowledge area. Project procurement management includes the processes that are necessary to purchase or acquire products, services, or results that are needed from outside the project team. Also, you should know by now that this definition translates into processes and activities that will allow us to manage procurement on our projects. To be precise, this translates into 4 processes in the PMBOK guide. The first being plan procurement management. This is the process of documenting project procurement decisions, specifying the approach, and identifying potential sellers. Once we have that, we will conduct our procurements in the process of obtaining seller responses, selecting a seller, and then also awarding the contract. Once we have the contract in place, we need to control our procurements. This is the process of managing procurement relationships, monitoring contract performance, and making changes and corrections as appropriate. And that is then followed by close procurement. This is possibly the process in the PMBOK guide with the shortest description ever, because all that the PMBOK guide tells us is that this is the process of completing each project procurement. Plan procurement management is the focus of this lesson, and because this process has the word plan in its name, I'm not even going to dare and ask you into which process group you think this falls, because it's so obvious. Obviously, this is a planning process. The others, however, it gets a little bit more complex there. We'll look at those in the upcoming lessons, of course, but it's important to know that this is one of those knowledge areas that pretty much distributes its processes throughout many of the process groups. We have one in executing, one in monitoring and controlling, and one in closing. The main concept that you have to understand in the plan procurement management process is that this is the process where you determine and document the procurement approach and decisions. You first have to determine if a procurement is even required. You have to understand and identify the needs of the project. You figure out which products, equipment, or services can be potential procurement items. Note that buying may be needed either as part of the project that you are running or as part of the product that you have to deliver. For instance, as part of your project, you may need to procure the services of a temporary project scheduler to help you manage your project schedule. And as part of your product, you procure 3,000 screws with bolts that are needed for manufacturing your project's product. We will go into more detail later about how the make versus buy analysis helps in the decision if procurement is required. If indeed procurement is required, then you have more work to do. You also have to decide the how, what, how much, and when details of procuring the needs, goods, services, or results. An important part of planned procurement management is also identifying and evaluating potential sellers who can provide such goods and services. There is a lot to do to plan your procurements, so your planning effort is commensurate and tied to cost and time available to deliver the project, which brings us to a related point. It is important that you mind schedule constraints as you plan procurements. Your schedule is a major consideration when creating the procurement management plan and figuring out your approach to procurement, as schedule constraints can affect every procurement management process. For example, if your schedule says that you need those 3,000 screws and bolts completed in 4 weeks, but your in-house capacity allows for a maximum of 2,000 completed by then, well, something has to happen. As part of your project, when you plan the procurements, you are likely to conduct a make or buy analysis in order to come to a make or buy decision. This is part of what you do as you review the risks. You will ask many questions, such as which option, make or buy, carries more risk for you? Which of the two provides greater benefit with less opportunity cost? You'd also have to assess the importance of proprietary information as you appraise your risks during the make or buy decision. For example, if the project is using a top-secret innovative technology in a very competitive field, then you may not want to go outside of your organization. If you do, you may have to consider very tight non-disclosure agreements. So you see, there is quite a range of choices and decisions to be made when you plan procurement management. We move on to the ITTO overview for the planned procurement management process. One thing that's immediately obvious is the sheer number of inputs and outputs that are used in this process. 9 inputs, 7 outputs. We also have a number of tools and techniques at our disposal. Based on these numbers, you can see that we do have quite a bit of work to do when we plan procurement management and go through this process, and we have quite a bit of work to do here in this lesson as well to explain it all to you. And here is our brief overview of the 9 inputs for the process. It all begins with the project management plan. Then we have the requirements documentation. We have the risk register, the activity resource requirements, the project schedule. Next, we have the activity cost estimates, the stakeholder register, the enterprise environmental factors, and the organizational process assets. We may not discuss each of these inputs explicitly because we have come across many of these in previous lessons as well, but as we discuss them, try to ask yourself, why do we need this input and where does it come from? In doing so, you will better understand the integrated nature of project management, which in turn will make each input much easier to recall for your PMP exam. Before we launch into a detailed discussion of the inputs of planned procurement management, let me address the question, why so many inputs? As it is, you may already be overwhelmed by them, and also brace yourself because this is not the only process with many inputs. You'll see that 3 out of the 4 processes here in the project procurement management knowledge area have quite a few inputs. They are necessary. It is inherent in the process because we are in the world of procurement and contracts. We are committing our resources, not only money, but time as well. We are taking some risk. As project managers, you want to make sure that the seller provides the specified product, service, or result for which you are paying. We need to take reasonable care and systematically perform our due diligence as we go outside of our organization to make a procurement or to subcontract a part of our project to someone else. It is therefore in our best interest to make sure that we review all possible aspects of each procurement. We need to prepare, be thorough in our research, and aim to have all the information necessary to establish the best approach and make the right procurement decisions for our project. That's why we have so many inputs. And with that out of the way, let's start from the top of our long list of 9 inputs where we have the project management plan. As you know, the project management plan consists of many subsidiary plans and subsidiary documents, and the 3 that interest us most here in project procurement management are the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the WBS dictionary as inputs to the plan procurement management process. So the project scope statement not only defines the scope and end result of the project, which might give you an idea of what has to be purchased, but it also includes your constraints and assumptions. A constraint could be a budget limit that constrains your ability in regards to purchasing, and an assumption could be the fact that we do not have the appropriate know-how in-house and we must purchase. One more important factor that you find in the scope statement are acceptance criteria. These criteria must be used during purchasing so that you purchase goods or services that ensure that you can meet those criteria. This is only a small selection of the items that you may find in the scope statement. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to always take the time to read the entire project scope statement very early on in the plan procurement's management process. The WBS then gives you the hierarchical structure of all your deliverables. Therefore, you'll be able to spot any relationships between items that you plan on procuring. For example, there could be components of work which are designated to be outsourced, or in other words, procured externally. And the WBS dictionary finally has a detailed description of the work that is required for each of these deliverables. It might be a great idea to read that description at this point and learn more about what exactly it is that we need to purchase. Remember, our main focus in the plan procurement's management process is that we want to figure out what it is that we will purchase. And the work breakdown structure and its associated dictionary are deliverables oriented and help you define the what you will have to purchase. Next, we have the requirements documentation, which details all the requirements for your project. So the requirements documentation should not only have all the business, stakeholder, solution, project, transition, and quality requirements, but should also include requirements that are relevant to procurement. You should pay special attention to requirements with contractual and legal implications. These requirements may pertain to materials, human resources, rights and permissions, basically anything that you may have to procure for a project. Let me give you 4 examples of things to consider from your requirements documentation. First of all, security. They just won't let anyone into an airport or plane anymore these days. And well, for some projects, you can't just let anyone work on it. Knowledge, skill, and ability in your team is important, but may not be sufficient. For example, if you're working on sensitive government projects, any contractor that you take on board will likely have to pass a very rigorous background check before you even tell them what the project is all about. Second, safety. Talking about airplanes here. If your project were about repairing aircrafts, I can guarantee you that as part of the requirements, you'd need to be able to trace the origin of any part that you buy and will be put on that aircraft. You'll require your vendor not only to deliver the part itself, but also to provide the supporting paperwork substantiating its origin. Our third example is about intellectual property rights. If your project requires you to set up a new auction site on the internet, when you consider companies to design and build your site, you need to understand if there are any proprietary models, techniques, or technologies involved, and if you and your potential providers have the appropriate rights to use them for the project. And lastly, licenses and permits. Your requirements documentation may state that you need a forklift. You should consider then that you probably also need to have a licensed forklift operator. Not just anyone can hop on the forklift that you procure and start moving things around in your warehouse. If you want to use your own personnel, you may have to pay for them to get the necessary training and the license, and this is part of procurement. From these examples, you can see that there is much to learn from your requirements documentation and so much that you need to consider for your project procurement management. Here's another important input, the risk register. Different project risks should have been considered when going through project risk management. The risk register lists the risks, the result of the risk analysis, and risk response planning. There are many procurement-related risks which may arise on your project. A couple of examples: what if prices of fuel suddenly shoot up, or what if you can't hire contractors with the appropriate experience and knowledge? In the project risk management lessons, we saw how a contract with its different terms and conditions can be an effective way to manage and mitigate the risk and sharing potential risk with a seller. So you need to consider if you can transfer a risk to someone else, namely the seller, via a contract. This is precisely what you do when you purchase insurance, for example. You need to be aware of what your risks are, how likely they are, and what mitigating strategies are planned or in place so that you can plan for them as you make your risk-related procurement decisions. You may recall from the project time management lessons that the activity resource requirements are an output of the estimate activity resources process. The PMBOK guide defines activity resource requirements as the types and quantities of resources that are required for each activity in a work package. The activity resource requirements, when you consider them collectively, are like a shopping list in a way that will list the people, equipment, tools, locations, and so on that are required by your project. But unlike the woman here in the photo, you don't want to be creating this list at the very last minute when you're already in the shop there with your shopping basket. But in terms of processes, plan procurement management, the process we're looking at right now, comes before conduct procurements, which means that we are going to be reviewing the activity resource requirements now in this process here. That way you know what you will need to buy, where you should buy it from, how much you should be paying for it, and other important details. Next, we have the project schedule as an input which informs you of your timelines and delivery dates. It will also make you aware of dependencies and schedule constraints so that you can plan your procurements accordingly. Remember those schedule constraints we were talking about earlier? You want to meet your project deadlines. There are also ways to save time and resources when doing a procurement. For instance, by predefining a preferred seller's list of a particular product, or by using boilerplate contract templates with the aim of not deviating too much from what has already been vetted out in past agreements in order to reduce the time that is spent on a legal review. The activity cost estimates show your cost estimates for each activity. This cost includes all the resources, both direct and indirect, that you need on the task, like labor, material, equipment, and so on. It may also include allowances for inflation or a contingency reserve amount. Why do we need this as an input? You use these activity cost estimates to compare them against bids or proposals that you get from vendors. Assuming your estimates are fairly accurate, in other words, your cost estimation methods were sound and underlying assumptions behind your estimates have not radically changed since when your estimates were created, you can then use these estimates to gauge if bids and proposals you receive are actually reasonable. If your activity resource requirements are like your shopping list, then your stakeholder register, our next input here, would be more like your guest list to your project. The stakeholder register is a result of the Identify Stakeholders process, and it presents us with the names of all the identified stakeholders and the influence that they have on our project, their needs and expectations, as well as planned strategies to mitigate or strengthen the impact that they have. Why do we need this input? Well, in procurement, you have to know how to handle stakeholder relationships well in order to meet your project's procurement goals. That is why the stakeholder register is an invaluable input. You need to know who are your champions or potential resistors, who the influencers and decision makers are, who has the technical knowledge and who can provide expert judgment that you will need in this process. Procurement can be complex, so know your stakeholders. For example, procurement of services such as marketing, IT, legal services, and so on can be very tricky. Or perhaps your organizational landscape may be so complex that even a simple procurement may require you to be savvy in how to deal with your stakeholders. So it is good to know your stakeholders to know how to best navigate through the process. You should know who among the stakeholders can help or who may hinder the process. When it comes to the enterprise environmental factors here in the planned procurement's management process, we are interested in knowing what external and internal factors influence purchasing. Let's begin with the external factors and look at marketplace conditions. For example, are the products, services, and results available in the market? Are there by any chance limited suppliers? Are there any local unique requirements that we have to know about? And the internal factors, here we're talking about centralized versus decentralized procurement functions in our organizations. This determines how much procurement we can do ourselves as project managers within the project, or if we have to coordinate and rely on a purchasing department or purchaser outside of our project organization. You also need to be aware of any existing arrangements with suppliers or other buyers which may be in place within your organization. We won't go too much into detail in this lesson, as we have already covered this in the Project Procurement Management Overview and in a separate lesson fully dedicated on the enterprise environmental factors. Next, we are also interested in knowing how the organizational process assets may affect our project in regards to purchasing. In this photo here, you see a project manager making a purchase online. Well, in your organization, as a project manager, are you allowed to purchase items for your project on your own like this? Do you have a corporate credit card? If so, when is it appropriate for you to use it? How do you arrange and pay for work-related travel? And what is your spending authority? These are just a few questions that are related to procurement, and the answers to those you'll find in the organizational process assets. And of course, not just any and all organizational process assets. Here we're talking about policies, guidelines, and standard operating procedures that will define how you perform your procurement activities. But these may not necessarily exist in a formal fashion. They may be informal. Only if you consider both will you get a complete picture of how you have to do procurement. A formal policy may be that you have to input all your purchasing activities into a central computer system, and an informal policy would be that, not officially written down, but the head of information technology acts as a gatekeeper when purchasing anything IT related. So it would be a good idea that if you need to make an IT purchase, that you run that by him before you get too far into the process. There may also be rules about the types of contracts which we are allowed to use, or that we have certain preferred sellers for a category of products, or maybe that all sellers first have to go through an approval process. All of this is defined in the policies, guidelines, and standard operating procedures, formal or informal, that are part of our organizational process assets. And with that, we have come to the end of part 1 here in our lesson on plan procurement management. Justine?
I wish you well. Be happy.
Until next time.